This is a short lecture about interpreting historical sources, specifically primary and secondary sources, as well as bias. Throughout this course, you will be asked to review and analyze primary and secondary sources. So I wanted you to have at least a basic understanding of the distinction between the two. Okay, so let's talk about primary sources first. Primary sources really have two distinguishing characteristics. One, that they were written and created at the time under discussion. For example, if we were talking about World War I and the source is from World War I, then that would be the time under discussion and it would be a primary source. The other distinguishing characteristic is that it was a first-hand account. In other words, if there was analysis, it's usually without the benefit of hindsight. In other words, it's a first-hand account, not someone telling you what happened or interpreting what happened. Let's take a look at a few examples of primary sources. Photographs, audio recordings, video recordings, or films of contemporary events, journals, diaries, letters, maps. Maps can also be a secondary source, and I will discuss that in just a few minutes when we talk about secondary sources. Speeches, books, newspapers, and magazine articles published at the time. Oral histories. Oral histories you hear a lot of, particularly in Native American culture. Oral histories are generally histories that are either transcribed or passed down from generation to generation. In modern time, they're often recorded or filmed. You have autobiographies, which are basically books about a person. They wrote it about themselves. Pamphlets, advertising, artifacts such as clothing or costumes. You're not going to necessarily see that in this course. You might see some pictures of it, but not necessarily the artifacts themselves. They're generally held in museums or in private collections. All right, so let's take a look at secondary sources. Secondary sources are just the opposite of primary sources. They are not first-hand accounts, and they are not written or created at the time under discussion. Some examples of secondary sources are history books, academic journal articles, thematic maps, and the distinction between a primary source map and a secondary source map is that a secondary source map is generally in color and it generally has legends. In other words, if you saw a map that was really compiled of congressional data, congressional election data, or presidential election data, that would be a secondary map. And you can usually tell the difference because it has a color and it has a legend. Often there are maps that are from the time period, depending generally, but depends on when it was, and it's generally held in museums, and you don't often see those as much, and you definitely won't be seeing those you won't be seeing primary maps anyway in this course. Okay, let's talk briefly about bias. Bias is often thought of as a negative word, but with respect to sources, it's really not. It's not negative and it's not positive. It just is. Just as today, people from the past had bias. And they're not, and again, it's not a bad bias. It's what you bring to the table when you're witnessing your event or when you're talking about an event. Some examples of bias are nationality, where you're from. Are you from America? Are you from Canada? Are you from Mexico? Where are you from? Economic status, are you rich? Are you poor? Are you middle class? Somewhere in between? What you do for a living or your occupation? Your social status, and sometimes social status is associated with economic status and sometimes it's not. Social status separated from economic status may be if you've lived in a town for a long time and you have a family legacy of some sort. Contemporary events, political beliefs, gender, male or female, gender identification, how you view yourself, sexual orientation, gay or straight, religion or lack of religion, ethnicity, I would add race along with that, and social and philosophical bias. What that means is social bias is generally how you relate to other people. Are you part of an organization such as a sorority or a fraternity or a club? you obviously have similar interest if you're in that club or some sort of society. All right, I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, please let me know, and take care.